tidak bisa juga dapat ikan. Kadang kan sapinya suami memancing, kadang ikannya ada, kadang juga tidak ada, baru jauh lagi tempatnya. Kadang kalau ikan tidak dapat, terpaksa kita pukul batu, pikul dari sungai ke sini.
Dampak ke masyarakat ini banyak. Kalau anak-anak mandi di laut, badannya gatal. Kalau kita mau cuci pakai air laut sudah tidak bisa karena sudah kotor.
Saya punya kakak yang pernah dikena gatal-gatal. Hancur dia punya paha. Gara-gara gatal-gatal itu dia berbiji-biji ya kan? Biji-biji, habis itu dia luka. Luka kadang kan kalau digaruk, dia luka. Jadi itu nih, luka-luka semua dia punya badan. Gara-gara gatal-gatal kan dia itu kadang kalau tidak memancing gurita, ya menyilam.
Karena sebelum ini ada limbah tambak ini kita aktivitas di rumput laut ya alhamdulillah. Istilahnya ada keseimbangan, tapi sekarang ya bukan lagi setengah mati, mati setengah. Ya itu tanggapannya karena penolakan katanya. Padahal kejadiannya juga kompensasi ada. Hanya masuk di asetnya desa. Keluarga enggak ada. Sama sekali enggak ada. Berarti kita ini masyarakat Indonesia ini hanya merdeka penjajahan bangsa luar. Tapi di balik itu dijajah oleh pemerintahnya sendiri. Contohnya itu sudah ditolak, masih mau ini. Nah nyata-nyata kita di sini sudah lumpuh. Jadi kalau jadi itu sudah stroke. Iya tuh, bahasa kasarnya ini bahasa kasarnya.
Kalau harapannya masyarakat ini maunya dijernihkan kembali ini airnya toh, supaya kita pasang rumput laut lagi di macam-macam di pinggir sini.
Ya setidaknya ya ada kompensasi sedikit lah bagaimana caranya supaya ada ini itu sentuhan ke masyarakat. Tapi ini sama sekali tidak ada.
Now, let me introduce our panelists who will each bring unique insights on today's issues. First, we have Saidati Haya Afra, or Haya, from Satya Bumi. She will present research findings on the condition of the Bajau, the deforestation caused by nickel mining, and the nickel supply chain that connects Kabaena to automakers around the world. And then second, we're going to have Dr. Catherine Sealing from Columbia's University Mellman School of Public Health, who will share results from water and shellfish tests, illustrating the dangerous health impacts of heavy metal contamination from nickel mining. And then we're going to have Dr. Indra Shidusani from Healthspring, who will delve into the public health challenges caused by heavy metal exposure and offer policy suggestions to mitigate this risk. And then fourth, we're going to have Magdalena Miskiewicz from the Directorate General for Trade at the European Commission, who will discuss the EU's Mineral Partnership Program, ongoing CEPA negotiations, and how sustainability standards in EU trade could support protections for communities like the Bajau. And finally, we have Chris Alford from the Sunrise Project, who will speak about the global EV industry, responsibilities of automakers in corporate governance, and possible policy solutions to address these harms. So let's start with Haya from Satya Bumi. Haya, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hans. Thank you so much again for you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Haya, researcher in Satya Bumi, and I'm so happy to seeing familiar faces here. So basically, I will share Satya Bumi most recent findings on energy transition today. And the slide, I give the title Energy Transition in Question, from Kabaena's Dirty Nickel to the World. So why is that? Why Kabaena's Dirty Nickel and how it relates to the world? So we will listen and discuss about that afterwards. But before that, I want you to see the picture that I put before this still on the previous slide. Yeah, I want you to see the picture here. This is how Bajau people in Kabaena, they are facing a serious threat from nickel concessions. So up to the hill, there are two most detrimental concessions, PTTGAA and PTTIM. And as you can see here, this is their sewage. They dump it right to the ocean. And you can see this is the Bajau houses. This is the Bajau village. So basically, for you who is asking, who is Bajau community and why it is so important. So basically, Bajau community is arguably the last sea nomads that this world has, and they live on small islands. They tend to live on small islands. Why? Because they tend to live in an isolated way of life. And this is why small islands as Kabaena is the perfect place for Bajau people to live and then to nurture their traditional way of life. Next, please. Yeah, so if I have to put Kabaena in a snapshot, this is it. On the right side, you can see this is Kabaena Island. Basically, Kabaena Island is an island that the area is only 891 kilometers squares, or as large as Berlin, Germany. And then 73% of its land has been confiscated by mining operations. The orange boxes in Kabaena is all nickel concessions. And as you can see too, all the orange boxes, they are stacked, they're located all at the shoreline. And from north to south to east and to west, they are all Bajau villages in here. As of 2024, 40% permits are operational. Although management of coastal areas and small islands law in Indonesia prohibits exploitation on small island. So I just want to say what I'm trying to say in this slide is any automaker who are sourcing nickel raw material from Kabaena Island is practically giving an omission or practically engaging in illegal activity based on Indonesian law. Next. So this is it. This is the before and after. Bajau village has been destroyed by nickel dumping, poor waste management. So on the left side is the before. We can see all the Bajau kids. They are playing, they are diving, they can catch sea cucumber, they can catch lobster from living coral reefs on their area. And then the right side is the after nickel mining destroyed their villages, the coastal area. Next. So this is the overall findings. So Satya Bumi have been monitoring, observing, talking to so many stakeholders about the condition of Bajau community, and Kabaena is a small island. Between 2010 until 2013, 3 Bajau children in Bariala village died because of drowning in murky waters. The Bajau community has experienced dramatic lifestyle changes, forces to stop fishing, and children are no longer learning to drive. This is so ironic. Why is it? Because since the beginning of their age, since 3 years old, Bajau children already mastering diving. As I said earlier, they can go catch sea cucumber and so on and so forth. But after this nickel rush came to their house, their parents are no longer allow them to go swimming. Of course, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, this is how their seawaters turn. And then as we can see, and then probably Dr. Catherine and Dr. Interstry will tell us why their children no longer allow them to do so, because they can get a serious skin problem. The community health center recorded acute skin disease and respiratory infections among Bajau in Pu'ununu and Baliara. Deforestation in protected forests has occurred extensively. No compensation was provided. A few community members, 50 to be precise, in Pu'ununu received only $3 as handshake money for their signature without prior information about mining project. Next. Yeah, so this is the deforestation number. You can see the complete analysis on this, I just want to say that the last water resource in Kabaena, located in Tangkeno village, is now under threat as PT Bakti Bumi Sulawesi is set to open a permit in a protected forest. And now the community member in Tangkeno village, they are trying to stand against this idea to open and then to clear the protection forest, because all their groundwater, all their rivers are already polluted, and they don't want the last water resource for them to be polluted as well. Should they go 4 hours, 5 hours to the capital city just to get drink water? Next. And then this is about the livelihood disruption. So basically, we interview 52 community members. Not all of them is Bajau, some of them is Moronene tribes and Bugis tribe, and over 82% of interviewees stated that nickel mining on Kabaena has decreased their income. So it's validated by their statement. And also nickel mining waste pollutes seawater, and then also significantly reducing fish catches. Many Bajau now forced to work as informal laborers at mining sites, placing them in an unstable economic situation. I have to say that many Bajau community members are not going to get a formal education, whereas in order to be able to work in mining company, they have to hold a academic certificate. That's why they are working in a very precarious situation, and then they get like uncertainty with paying and so on and so forth. The soil is no longer fertile, pushing Moronene community to sell their cocoa, clove, and cashew plantation. Next, please. So this is the pictures that I want you all to see how they live in a very extreme poverty. This is the living condition of the Bajau people in Puununu village, East Kabaena. This is a joint home measuring just 4 × 3 meters square. This house is there is 3 families there with 11 children. The Bajau community in Kabaena lives in an extreme poverty because they do not reside on land. So they think that they don't have the right to demand compensation, to demand the government to give them, to not destroy their ocean. They don't have right because they don't have land. And this narrow perspective on compensation and then also restoration in Indonesia made Bajau people live in a very vulnerable situation. Next, please. So this is the environmental degradation. As you can see on the right side, this is where the coral reefs are dying, and then in the middle, this is how poor their waste management. They don't make like a dam for their waste. That's why every heavy rain, only for 1.5 hours, they will flood the entire Baliara village. Next. And then this is the health issue. I believe Dr. Catherine and Dr. Intresi will delve into this more. Next. And then this is the Kabaena supply chain. We carried out corporate mapping and investigation into which individuals and organizations are linked to issue in Kabaena. And interestingly, in order to create this whole ecosystem on nickel industry in Kabaena, we found several links to politically exposed person in Indonesia. One of them is arguably the big corruption case in Indonesia, Nur Alam. And you can see in this site, you can see who are you sourcing nickel from China, Germany, all over the world, Europe, America, and any other part of the world. Next. And this is also saying the same basically. And for the most interesting fact is also PT Tonia Mistra Sejahtera awarded by government because of their highest production of nickel ore. So the highest production in Southeast, located in Southeast Sulawesi, and it's located in a very small island called Kabaena. Next. So this is the recommendation. We have a very lengthy list of the recommendation, but I want to highlight some of the most important recommendation. For the government, we demand the government to shut down all mining operation in Kabaena, since it shouldn't be any mining in the first hand because of the coastal and management small island management law. And the government to conduct comprehensive assessment of metal exposure, and then implementing biological monitoring strategies, and also provide medical, psychological, and economic support for losses and human rights violation on the island. For mining companies, we demand all the mining companies related to the supply chain that I mentioned before to halt all mining activities in Kabaena, to restore all environmental damages and address human rights violation, especially those affecting to the Bajau people. And then lastly, practice responsible mining and producer clinical following the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible and supply chain mineral. And last but not least, for electric vehicle manufacturers, we demand all the manufacturers to ensure that none of the nickel is sourced from Kabaena, to provide remedies related to the operation of automobile factories, and to transparently publish the nickel battery supply chain used by automobile manufacturer, because only by this transparency we can know how to address all the environmental and human rights impact and how to restore them. And I think this is next. So I think this is that's all of our findings. You can always look on the more detailed findings in our report that you can scan the QR code here. Thank you so much. Haya, over back to you, Hans.
Thank you very much, Haya, for sharing some of the findings from the report, and it's very eye-opening to see the environmental damage and the human rights violation that is happening on such a tiny island, and how it relates to the global supply chain. So thank you again, Haya. So next we have Dr. Catherine and Dr. Indrashi, who's gonna explain more about the environmental damages, the pollution, as well as the health risks associated with the nickel mining in Kabaena. Please, Dr. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans, and thank you for inviting me to present here. And good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. So I'm Dr. Catherine Schilling. I'm an assistant professor in environmental health sciences at Columbia University. My work mainly focuses on metal exposures in the environment and their health impacts on diverse communities, with a particular focus on marginalized, environmentally overburdened communities. I work very often with Native Americans. So next slide, please. So nickel mining doesn't just release nickel into the environment. It often brings along metals, many of which are highly toxic. And this is the mine on Kabaena Island. And I have to acknowledge that all the photos were taken by Satya Bumi, which I'm showing here in my presentation. So when nickel ore is extracted, like metals like lead, cadmium, mercury, arsenic, zinc, and copper can also be released as byproducts. So the reason why they can be released as byproducts because they're chemically similar. And what you see here is these metals then enter the surrounding environment, particularly in the waterways. And here it's the river where the metals are basically washed out from the mine. And this is important to understand because even though nickel is the primary metal being mined, the health risk comes from the combined presence of multiple metals at extremely high concentration. They are released into the environment. Next slide, please. So if you take a look at this chart in the photo, which I really liked, so most of the toxic metals actually are invisible. It looks like just a little bit of muddy water. But the problem with metals is you can't see them, you can't smell them, and you can't taste them. So if you think of this child is swimming in this water or eating the local food that seems perfectly fine from outside, it can contain high levels of metals, and most of them are toxic. So the child has no way of knowing that this danger they're surrounded with, and nor their parents without a specialized testing. So without testing the water or testing the food, you don't know that the metals in the water or in the food are extremely high. And this invisibility is one of the reasons why metal contamination is so harmful, because it's difficult to detect. And until the health issue appears, it might be many years down the line, and it might be very problematic then. So next slide, please. So these are also very nice photos. And what you see here is the metals are released from mining, and they just don't stay at one place. So in the coastal mining regions like those in Kabaena Island, the metals primarily enter the water through wash-off and runoff from the mining sites. And that's the reason why you have this muddy water along the coastline. So a global research assessment by a study in Science, they released that 90% of toxic metals are attached to the sediments. So these are sediments are very, very tiny particles of soil and sand in the water in suspension. And these allow the metals to travel very long distance from its original location. And so in fact, if the sediments with the metals can travel up to 100 kilometers away from the mining site. So that means that even communities who live very far from an actual mining site or polluted site can still be affected by metal contamination from the rivers or the waters they carry it. So when the mining runoff occurs, it typically brings the sediment with the metals loaded into the ocean at Kabaena Island. And so along the way, when these are carried into the water, what you see here, these are then taken up, the tiny particles are taken up by phytoplankton, so the very small organism, and then gradually moving up the food chain. So this is called bioaccumulation. So as each organism retains a little bit more metals in the body. So by the time the metals actually reach larger marine life and eventually humans, they become concentrated, and this process is called biomagnification. So this means that fish or shellfish that people consume on the island have very high concentration of metals, and they can be much, much higher than you can find in the water. So next slide, please. And this is exactly what we see on Kabaena Island from the shellfish. They have been collected by Satya Bumi, and metals have been measured. So what you see here, if the community relies on shellfish as a stable food, so what you see is that the metal levels in shellfish from the Kabaena Island compared to the safety limits of the established WHO Experts Committee on Food Additives. So the team of Satya Bumi collected the shellfish and did the metal analysis, and we did an assessment on how the concentration are compared to the WHO guidelines. So the red bars in each graph shows you the levels of metals detected in the shellfish on Kabaena Island. The green bars shows you the WHO safety limits, which are far lower than detected levels. So levels of nickel, cadmium, lead, and copper in these shellfish significantly exceed the safe limits established by the WHO. So that means for most of the metals, the concentration are 3 to 70 times higher than the WHO recommended safety thresholds. So why does it matter? Okay, if the community relies on the shellfish as a stable food, so when these toxic metals build up in shellfish, that means they potentially could build up in the people who consume them. So that means over time, this leads to a cumulative effect, and that raises the risk of chronic health issues. And that might also, again, appear years later after they have been exposed to such high levels of metals. Next slide, please. Here in this slide, we are comparing two critical measurements for understanding the toxic metal exposure if the community consumes shellfish. It's called the estimated daily intake, EDI, and the reference dose, RFD. So EDI, the estimated daily intake, shows you how much of each metal the community is likely to eat every day if they consume shellfish. And the reference dose is shown as the safety threshold for each metal. So this represents the maximum safe level of daily intake according to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So the reference dose values are very conservative and intend to protect against health risks of a lifetime. So if what you see here in the yellow bar is actually the estimated daily intake when you consume the shellfish available around Kabaena Island is much, much higher than the reference dose from the US Environmental Protection Agency. So when we compare these bars, we can see that all the four metals basically analyzed in the shellfish would exceed the reference dose. And this is by significant levels that should be considered as non-safe and could have a huge health risk for the community. Next slide, please. But as I said, we cannot look at all the metals individually. We have to look at them in a cumulative effect on the body because all of them go to different organs. They have different target organs and a different concentration, and they affect it in different ways. So we have, what I said, we have nickel, zinc, copper, lead, arsenic in detectable levels, and they can cause kidney damage, like for cadmium. This can cause liver damage, cancer. Lead is known to be neurotoxic. It can have what we see on the photo here with the child. It can cause skin rashes, damage to reproductive system, and has cardiovascular health issues. So it's a very complex and even chronic low dose. What we see in communities is an issue, but these are extremely high values, and we need to consider what are the impacts on the community. And now from here, I would like that Dr. Indrashi is taking over and explain some more about the health impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Catherine, for the opportunity. Slides, please. Can we start from the first slide? Yeah. So let's start by evaluating the health risk of metal on Kabaena Island. I will introduce myself. I'm Dr. Indrashi Dusane. I'm the Associate General Manager for the Medical Operations Pan India for HealthSpring. I'm also a scientific committee member at International Commission on Occupational Health, ICOH. Next, please. So let's start with the health kinetics of nickel. So how does nickel enter into our body? How is it processed and how is it excreted? So there are three ways through which nickel can enter into our body. One is the inhalational route, oral route, and the dermal route. Now, the absorption of nickel depends on the form and the bioavailability. Following inhalation, insoluble nickel may clear from the upper lung via the mucociliary transport, basically, and then swallow and absorbed into the GI tract. So 20 to 35% of the inhaled soluble nickel may be absorbed into the bloodstream. This was through the inhalational route. Through the oral route, 1 to 40%, depending on what kind of food or water you're consuming, can be absorbed into the body. The amount and rate of nickel absorption is significantly higher from the GI tract, if at all the absorption is through water as compared to food. So nickel also penetrates through the skin, but the dermal absorption is slow and minimal. So now this absorbed nickel enters into the bloodstream and gets distributed to lung, thyroid, adrenals, kidneys, heart, liver, brain, spleen, and pancreas. Next, please. So a larger portion of the less soluble forms may be retained in the lungs. Nickel does not undergo any metabolism prior to excretion. This is a very important point. Nickel is primarily excreted through the urine, regardless of the exposure route. So whichever route of exposure it is, whether it is inhalational, oral, or dermal, nickel will be excreted through urine. If at all there is any unabsorbed nickel, it will be excreted through feces. Nickel has also been measured in sweat and breast milk, and the elimination half-life of nickel ingested from food is around 28 hours. Next. Let's look at nickel exposure to skin. Now, looking at the values that we have got from the Kabaena Island, nickel concentration in seawater ranges from around 3.1 to 3.5 milligram per liter, which far exceeds the limit for marine biota, which is 0.05 and for marine tourism, which is 0.75 milligram per liter. This is almost around 769 to 70 times above the standard for marine life. It has also been reported that nickel laterite mining can introduce higher levels of metal into the aquatic environment through mine tailing and direct discharge. Next. Further looking into the health effects of nickel on skin, it usually causes contact dermatitis, that is nickel allergy in common terms. That is the most reported effect of nickel exposure through the skin. Basically, it's an inflammatory reaction which is mediated by type 4 delayed hypersensitivity. Now, the prevalence of nickel sensitivity among the general population ranges from 11 to 16%, and it is more commonly observed in females. Basically, a rash typically develops at the site of contact with the nickel or nickel product, but can also develop away from the contact site. Patch tests on sensitive individuals indicates a concentration response relationship between the contact dermatitis severity and the nickel exposure. It basically means more the nickel exposure, more the contact dermatitis you will have. Nickel is also amongst the agent which induces lichen planus and lichenoid drug eruptions. Next, please. Here is a photograph from the island. This is nickel-induced allergic contact dermatitis, as you can see. Next. Further moving on, the common areas of nickel-induced allergic contact dermatitis is face, eyelids, and skin. It depends on how the exposure is, whether it is acute or chronic. Also depends on the nature, dose, and the frequency of exposure. Topical or systemic corticosteroids are commonly prescribed as a treatment for allergic contact dermatitis because of nickel. Avoiding re-exposure to the allergen, avoiding re-exposure to nickel is the best form of effective treatment. Next, please. This is an immunological look on how does nickel-induced allergic contact dermatitis work. Basically, it works in 3 phases. The first phase is the sensitization phase, in which the nickel is introduced to the skin for the first time. In this phase, there is no skin inflammation. The nickel gets absorbed into the skin, moves on through different cells, as you can see, reaches to the APCs, and finally to the T cell. After this, the T cells reproduce. Then we move on to the second phase, that is the elicitation phase. In this, we will have skin inflammation. So whenever there is repeated exposure to nickel, next time, there will be inflammation. And the inflammation is caused by the cells itself. Let's move on to the toxic metals, which has already been discussed by Dr. Catherine. In a nutshell, we can see that the levels of exposure are very sky high as compared to what the regulations have been. Next. Same here, the daily intake of toxic metals is very high. Next. As you can see here, the estimated daily intake as compared to the reference dose, especially if we look at nickel, it is almost 5.8 times high than the recommended value. Next. Let's look at what kind of health effects it can have when you ingest nickel, when it is through the oral route. As you can see, the nickel values, the target hazard question values ranges from 2.6 to 5.8. This basically increases the risk of pulmonary and nasal sinus cancer, which have been found in humans to be associated with heavy exposure to nickel compounds, proved with a lot of research. Offsprings of animal orally exposed to nickel during pregnancy had decreased survival and developmental abnormalities, may be elicited in humans also. Intermediate duration oral exposure studies in animals report alterations in hematological parameters and histological biochemical changes, especially in liver and kidneys. Oral exposure to nickel also causes gastrointestinal distress, giddiness, as it has been reported in workers who drank nickel-contaminated water. Next. Other effects of nickel exposure is the effect through the inhalational exposure. The most common effect is asthma. It causes an allergic response to the chronic inhalational exposure to asthma. Oral doses of nickel compounds in rat as low as 5.75 milligram nickel per kg per day induced effects like emphysema, bronchiectasis, pneumonitis, increased lung weight. Next. There are also epigenetic effects of nickel exposure. Nickel-induced epigenetic effects include preterm DNA methylation, post-translational histone modification. Nickel also produces measurable ROS, that is reactive oxygen species in the cells, and it depletes cellular glutathione. It basically reduces the antioxidant effect in your body, which in turn leads to more faster aging and can also increase the risk of all the cancers. Next. So recognition of nickel as hazardous has already been done. US Department of Health and Human Services classifies metallic nickel as reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. And International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies nickel and nickel compounds as carcinogenic to humans. Next. That's it from my side. Thank you so much. There's one more. So regulations for nickel exposure. To prevent development of nickel sensitivity, European Union in 1994 regulated the amount of nickel that may be released from objects with direct or prolonged skin contact. The level was set to around less than or equal to 0.5 microgram nickel per centimeter square per week. In 2014, this restriction was strengthened and was brought down to 0.2 microgram nickel per centimeter square per week. And this showed amazing results. Among the Danish women, the prevalence of nickel allergy decreased from 28% in 1985 to 17% in 2007. This shows that if we bring the regulations, it will bring down the health effects of nickel. Spot tests containing dimethylglobazine are available commercially, and these can be used to test for nickel concentration and nickel allergy. Next. Thank you. That's it from my side.
Thank you very much, Dr. Catherine and Dr. Indrashi for the presentation. So I would like to invite Magdalena from the Director General for Trade at the European Commission to share her thoughts on the issue. We are very interested to learn more about the issue from the EU perspective because some Europe automakers might be exposed to this unsustainable nickel from the island. So we are interested in hearing how sustainability standards like the EU trade could protect communities like the Bajau. So Magdalena, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I guess you haven't heard me. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm representing the Directorate for Trade in the European Commission. I am the team leader for the critical raw materials section in our unit that deals with industry matters from the trade perspective. We are present in trade negotiations. We are also participating in the negotiations of the partnerships, minerals partnerships with third countries. But we are also participating and running actually certain multilateral initiatives on raw materials. And I have joined the CRM team quite recently. Actually in September. But before that, and actually I still am, I was very much engaged in the negotiations of the free trade agreement with Indonesia. And I was personally responsible for the rules of origin for that trade agreement. But of course, the raw materials were also a big topic. And I will tell you a little bit where we are with those negotiations and what we are trying to do there. as I think that is most relevant to your subject. If you can go to the next slide. So maybe before I delve into the FTA agenda, I will briefly tell you what we are actually trying to do in the European Commission on critical raw materials. So yes, as the EU, we are participating very much in the frenzy for the sourcing of raw materials worldwide to prepare for the energy transition. And we have drafted our Major Regulation Critical Raw Materials Act that entered into force actually May this year. There was another directorate leading on that, Directorate for Industry, not the one that I am representing. But there, this act basically sets out the whole agenda on the raw materials for the EU. You will see there what are our goals in terms of the increase of production, processing, and recycling domestically. What we're trying to do also internationally. You have that on the screen. I don't need to read all this to you. We are just coming up with some ideas with investment partnerships, but we are also trying to, let's say, increase the production and recycling and processing of those raw materials via so-called strategic projects in the EU. So we have an agenda where we have invited the industry to actually submit their applications for the so-called strategic projects on mining in the EU or third countries, projects that involve also recycling of materials, and projects that involve also the processing of raw materials. However, when in doing so, every let's say company that wants to benefit from some from finance facilitation or from easier permitting process, they have to demonstrate that sustainability criteria that are listed in our regulation are respected. And we also have a special provision in the act that talks about the indigenous peoples. So where there are projects with the potential to affect indigenous people, there has to be a plan that the project promoter or the company that wants to launch a project has to prepare, and there has to be some sort of way demonstrated to us how the adverse impacts on the indigenous communities can be minimized. That also includes fair compensation for those peoples and measures. But this requirement is included, as I said, in the applications for strategic projects with the industry that wants to launch a project wherever in the world, including in Indonesia, if there is such an interest. They have to demonstrate that these terms are complied with. So next, please. As I said to you before, we are currently involved in negotiations, trade negotiation, a free trade agreement with Indonesia. And this has been a very long process. I think we've had already like 19 rounds going on, I think since 2016, if I'm not mistaken. With some pauses here and there. And I must say that, Indonesia is not an easy partner in these negotiations. We are very close to finalization of the talks, but what actually stops us from concluding is actually the treatment of access to raw materials. You know very well that, Indonesia prohibits exports of nickel, in particular and also bauxite or some other minerals. You may be also aware that the EU has launched a panel in the WTO, in the World Trade Organization, against Indonesia, claiming that Indonesia has introduced such an export restriction unlawfully, because this export restriction on exportation of nickel ores meant that the nickel stayed in the country for the purpose of, let's say, boosting the processing industry. And you may be well aware, that has attracted also a lot of Chinese investors who has launched their refining operations in Indonesia. The problem, if the ores stayed in the country and could not be exported, that had a very downward effect on prices. That meant that the refiners could benefit from cheap access to that nickel and then increase their refining operations even more. But the nickel that comes from Indonesia is not a class 1 nickel. Is not the cleanest nickel, the sulfide one, which goes directly into the battery production. This nickel is mostly used in the stainless steel production. So first you have to produce a ferronickel and then produce stainless steel. So what happened actually in the EU was that suddenly Indonesia became like major steel producer and exporter of that steel to the EU, which then created, of course, an adverse effect on our steel industry. We had to introduce trade remedies. So you see this nickel extraction and the whole frenzy did not really affect so much it didn't have an effect on increasing the production of the the batteries, but more actually increasing of production of steel. And then that had an impact on our markets as well. And this we had to take extra measures. And so in the end, in 2023, I think those exports stopped of this stainless steel that were actually using the nickel produced in Indonesia. So these measures have an adverse effect on other products. We tried to address that in the negotiations. We also, we try to address other measures as well that affect, the raw materials and nickel in the FTA negotiations that lead basically to, I would say, overcapacity, overproduction, and with the, let's say, in violation also maybe of certain rights or community rights or environmental conditions. We try to, impose or agree on certain criteria and cooperation with Indonesia on the raw materials, so that these dangerous or activities could be curbed or mitigated to some extent. Now I can tell you that these talks are quite difficult, and at this moment we sort of faced a little bit of a wall. The government has changed in Indonesia. And we are just waiting for a decision what next, because we have reached a stage where the decision on the fate of these negotiations and the commitments has to be taken at the highest level. If you go to the next slide. So in the free trade agreement, there are a number of various chapters. There is a chapter on energy and raw materials. In that chapter, we look carefully also on the energy, on the concessions for some, licensing for, we make sure that the policy actually that Indonesia is adopting is not discriminating against the European investors. But there are also certain provisions on raw materials. And we want to achieve, in particular, certain, I would say, commitments on the measures that Indonesia is taking. For example, we advocate no dual pricing, meaning that Indonesia should not, let's say, allow the nickel to be sold to, say, the refiners at a lower price that, let's say, nickel that could be sold outside. So we try to mitigate the adverse effect, economic effect on the market that Indonesia could provoke through its policy measures. No export restrictions or no export taxes, because we believe that these kind of measures may lead to overproduction, over exploitation. And in addition, of course, we would like to have cooperation with Indonesia to achieve, sustainable raw materials value chains. We want to cooperate with Indonesia on how to implement the environmental and social impact assessment, and how to implement the right environmental and social governance standards, safety standards, and how to enforce the right regulatory framework. Now, I must say that even there, we're not very successful. Indonesia is claiming that we need to recognize the sort of pace, and we need to give them time. They're not particularly ready to undertake this commitment. So you see, we have some certain ambition agenda in the FTA, but we are not yet, at a stage where Indonesia would make such a commitment. Now, if you go to the next slide, we also have a particular chapter. I was not a negotiator of this chapter, but I think that maybe amongst the participants to this webinar, I think there is a colleague that actually negotiated this trade and sustainable development chapter. It's still not finished, this chapter, but there we, let's say both parties normally commit to effective implementation of all the relevant ILO conventions on fundamental labor rights, freedom of association, collective bargaining, no forced labor, no child labor. Then we also, commit to have an effective implementation of all the multilateral environmental agreements, all the measures that, combat the illegal wildlife trade, legal logging, and all the illegal and unregulated fishing, so the sustainability standards. We cooperate. This is not a chapter where we actually impose sanctions for a lack of cooperation, but we try to stimulate certain cooperation and also focus on support and technical assistance to make sure that the third country properly can properly implement these commitments. Normally, in our FTAs, we usually have like the so-called TSD committee, which is our institutional body for engagement, but we also interact with civil society under the so-called domestic advisory groups. We have regular meetings, where members like NGOs, civil society in general participate, and that can also provide basis for launching of a panel against a third country if the country is not compliant with the commitments taken under the FTA. That's what we normally try to achieve in an FTA. For the moment, I think that chapter was almost finished, as I'm told, but for example, the dispute settlement mechanism is not yet finalized. So, we are on a good path, but we are still not there. If you go to the next slide. Right. Okay, so this is, as I said, this is what we were trying to do in the FTA with Indonesia, and we were not yet there. But in the meantime, we are also, as you know, because the frenzy and the rush for all the raw materials to speed up this energy transition, is everywhere, and a lot of countries, US and others of partners, are participating in it. Right. There is also this element of China. the dependency on China, and I think countries want to become more independent from also the single supplier to the market. And then, for example, China is a supplier of many materials like rare earths, where where it is an exclusive supplier of such a mineral. So you see, this is the sort of geopolitics of that, and that's why you will see many projects involving many raw materials, including also nickel, in many countries. Of course, the EU and the US and others are perfectly aware of all the consequences of though these endeavors that we are embarking on. And so what we are trying to do is first establish a sort of international community of members who would subscribe to the so-called ESG principles, meaning environmental, social, and governmental principles, and work with us to actually effectively implement them. So there is this, mineral security partnership initiative that has been launched by the US, but this initiative has been expanded into the so-called Mineral Security Partnership Forum, which we are leading, and we are leading on a policy dialogue with the third countries. We have basically just started, I would say, because now in December and in February we will be organizing workshops on involving all the members of this security forum on local value addition, also on how to make sure that the ESG standards are complied with, what are the challenges involved, and what can be the pathway to effective implementation of those. I must say that I am not like an expert in the technical expert. I'm not a geologist, in raw materials. I have colleagues that are, much more knowledgeable than I am. But what I have been impressed with is that with these initiatives, we have seen also, a good interest of a lot of European companies in providing, let's say, their services to third countries to mitigate all these, let's say, risks like water pollution. In many countries, it's not only, in Indonesia, they suffer exactly from the same reasons, that, for example, the tailings or the metals from the mines or from some plants or factories are dumped into rivers or are dumped into seas, and the countries are not able to process them to implement mitigating measures. But there are other companies that actually can provide certain services to limit the contamination and exposure to metals. So things can be done. What is needed is international cooperation, close international cooperation and commitment at political level that these standards, these principles should be respected. So this forum, this little initiative, now currently has 30 members. There are, of course, the developed country members and the developing country members that are resource rich. Unfortunately, Indonesia is not there, even though we have invited Indonesia to join. But Indonesia has had a problem with accepting these principles, as I find it. So it's not clear, what other incentive we should provide for Indonesia to join this forum. I mean, it's also a question at the political level, to be addressed at political level. So I think, basically politically, the EU cannot do it alone. There has to be pressure also from other countries to press Indonesia to adopt certain standards. So we have challenges, first, even the agreement on the WTO panel on nickel. We haven't finalized, the Indonesia lost its case. The measures have been found unlawful. We're trying to find a settlement with Indonesia to somehow solve this, because Indonesia does not want to abandon its policy. They believe that this policy
Sorry, Magdalena.
Yeah.
We do have some time constraints, so if you
Yeah,
can wrap
okay.
up your.
I was just going to wrap up. So I'm just saying that we're still not yet there. We have some challenges, but we hope that in the end we'll be able to meet them. So thank you so much, and sorry for exceeding my time.
Thank you very much, Magdalena, for sharing your insights. There are definitely some opportunities and efforts have been made to engage with Indonesia, but also clearly some challenges still ahead. So yeah, thank you again, Magdalena. So next we have Chris. Please, the floor is yours. And if you can keep your presentation less than 10 minutes, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hans, and thanks very much for the invitation. I can see some great questions coming in through the chat, so I'll try to keep this this brief. But yeah, my name is Chris Alford. I'm a senior strategist on auto supply chains with the Sunrise Project, a global climate justice organization. But today I'll be talking about, on behalf of Lead the Charge, a global network looking to pressure the automotive industry to build clean and equitable supply chains. So if we could just actually skip forward 2 slides. Yep, next one as well. And one more. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Yeah, so Lead Charge Network, we're a global network of civil society organizations spanning multiple countries across working on multiple issues ranging from human rights through to climate organizations and many more. But what brings us together is a vision for the automotive industry where all vehicles are made equitably, so where human rights are advanced across supply chains, sustainably, so where the environment is preserved and restored across the supply chain from mining all the way through to manufacturing, and whilst also reducing primary resource demand through efficient resource use and increasing recycled content. And finally, as well, so we believe the future of the automotive industry is electric, and want to see a transition to electric vehicles, but we also want to see that these vehicles are made with a fossil fuel-free supply chain as well. So not just zero emissions from the tailpipe, but zero emissions across the supply chain as well. And so what I would like to just talk a little bit about today is how some of these issues play out in the automotive industry, and what is the role of the automotive industry in helping to address some of the issues and the very concerning impacts we've talked about, we've heard today. So if we could go on to the next slide. So at Lead the Charge, we believe that the EV transition is really an opportunity because it's a moment of industrial transformation. So we are seeing the supply chains of the automotive industry be transformed to serve the electric vehicle transition. And this opportunity can be capitalized on to transform heavy industries that depend on automotive supply chains as a key source of revenue. And so in Lead the Charge, we focus on 3 supply chains specifically. So on to the next slide, please. And these 3 supply chains are steel, aluminum, and batteries, including the minerals that go into batteries. And we focus on these 3 supply chains for various reasons. Firstly, they compose the most weight of electric vehicles. Secondly, they're responsible for around 70% of upstream emissions of electric vehicles. And thirdly, most importantly for us, is the automotive industry plays a key role in terms of its impact on these industries and its leverage over these industries. It is the largest global consumer of aluminum, the largest global consumer of batteries, a rapidly growing industry, and also a major consumer of steel. As Magdalena pointed out, nickel is also a key ingredient into stainless steel, and automotive industry is also a major consumer of steel globally. And so what we are calling on the automotive industry to do is to use its leverage and its purchasing power to drive up standards across human rights, environment, and climate in these industries to help to drive a just transition towards electric vehicles from mining all the way through to manufacturing. And go on to the next slide, please. However, with the electric vehicle transition, there are also risks. And so whilst we do see opportunities, there's also risks that need to be addressed. And here we often talk about business as usual practices. And that's to say that a lot of the types of impacts that we've heard about today are not unique to electric vehicle supply chains. They're problems that have plagued the extractive industry in particular for decades and have been present in automotive supply chains for a very long time, even before the advent of electric vehicles. However, with the transition, we do see new risks. For example, here is one mentioned in relation to indigenous people's rights. One study has found that 54% of energy transition mineral projects are located on or near indigenous people's lands. And so addressing these risks old risks that have occurred through the extractive industry for many years and new risks that are occurring as a result of the transition to electric vehicles is essential as the industry transitions. And here it's important to say that these aren't just risks to local communities, but they're also risks to the companies themselves and importantly to automotive companies as major downstream consumers of these minerals that go into their supply chains. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. And this is from a report from the OECD, which I think really helps to illustrate this risk to the companies themselves, and talks about how any perceived benefits in terms of deprioritizing short-term or localized risks and prioritizing low human rights and environmental standards can actually increase the costs in the long term by leading to larger conflicts, impeding investments, and leading to unpredictable supply chain disruptions. And this can end up actually resulting in huge costs, both to the companies that are implementing such projects and as well to their downstream consumers. For example, a major mining project that is closed due to suffering litigation or breaking the law can suffer costs of roughly $20 million for every week that production is delayed. So these are risks not just to local communities, but they're risks that automakers should be prioritizing for their own business interests as well. And on to the next slide, please. So what are we calling on automakers to do? And I'd just like to focus here a little bit on our top level demands, but also what this could mean for issues such as nickel sourcing from countries such as Indonesia. And so on the one hand, we're calling on automakers to set and enforce credible targets and policies that apply to their supply chain. So, for example, have they set in place policies related to supply chain due diligence? And have they set in place credible and requirements for their suppliers to respect human rights and to implement due diligence? But also, we heard about the important issue of supply chain transparency, and this is a really critical issue if we are to drive improved standards and performance across automotive supply chains. So also calling on companies to disclose their progress towards their targets. So if they've set human rights commitments, disclosing what they're doing to ensure these commitments are being met, but also disclosing their supply chains more broadly and what risks and impacts they have identified and what they are doing to address these risks and impacts. A third area is around what I mentioned of automakers, the importance of them using their purchasing power and leverage to drive up standards across automotive supply chains. And so here, for example, what activities are they undertaking directly with their suppliers in order to make sure that they uphold the highest human rights and environmental standards? For example, are they conducting audits of their suppliers' mining sites? Do they have a grievance mechanism in place in order to ensure that affected communities can raise complaints and grievances with regards to impacts on their human rights? Are they ensuring that their suppliers provide access to remedy when human rights abuses have been identified and collaborating with that as well? And then finally, also, are they partnering with rights holders and other stakeholders across the supply chain in order to advance these issues from mining through to manufacturing? So as part of their due diligence, they should also be engaging directly with impacted local communities in their supply chains, but also with civil society organizations, with policymakers, with multi-stakeholder initiatives that can help drive up standards such as the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance and others, in order to help to drive this just transition from mining through to manufacturing. And on to the next slide. And so to lead the charge, we publish an annual benchmark that looks into these issues and essentially evaluates how automakers perform with regards to these expectations and these demands. So we look at 18 of the world's leading automakers that are leading the transition to electric vehicles, and look at, on the one hand, issues of sustainability and decarbonization, but on the other hand, also respect for human rights and approaches to responsible sourcing, looking at critical issues here related to the transition to electric vehicles, such as responsible transition mineral sourcing, workers' rights, and indigenous people's rights to free, prior, and informed consent. And on to the next slide. And just and I'll finish up here just to say that another way that we can look at how automakers are addressing these issues in their supply chains is by applying frameworks such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So this is how, in the annual benchmark that we publish, we look at the performance of companies with regards to their human rights due diligence and responsible sourcing practices. So have they set in place human rights commitments, as I mentioned before? And what are they doing to actually identify on the one hand, to map their supply chains all the way through to the point of extraction, but then also to identify human rights risks across their supply chain? And then what are they doing to prevent, mitigate, and account for the human rights risks and impacts that they're seeing across their supply chain? So what work are they doing with their suppliers in terms of assessing their human rights performance, conducting audits, implementing incentives and requirements for suppliers to ensure that they respect human rights and uphold higher environmental standards? And finally, the issue of access to remedy as well. Do they have a grievance mechanism, and are they ensuring that human rights abuses and negative environmental impacts they have identified in their supply chains are being remedied? And then on to the final slide. And we've now published this annual benchmark 2 years in a row. And just to share some overall findings from this year, the second edition, that we are seeing progress on these issues. In particular, I think with regards to some of the areas of human rights due diligence, a particular driving force behind that has been some of the new due diligence legislation and regulations we've seen in key markets such as the European Union. However, there's a huge gap, and industry-wide results are lackluster, indicating a need for a massive accelerated performance. And a particular concerning area of the leaderboard is related to precisely these just transition areas. So, for example, automakers are really failing on the issue of indigenous rights and ensuring that are conducting due diligence into their supply chains to ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples, in particular to free, prior, and informed consent, are respected by their suppliers, and also with regards to workers' rights as well. However, the good news is that we have seen that, that there are best practices across the industry, and that actually, if we were to combine the highest score by any automaker, then that would result in a score of over 70%. So that means that good practice can be seen sporadically throughout the industry, and that a way that the automotive companies can improve their performance is to look at this best practice and improve their performance by raising their standards and their practices to other best performing automakers across different areas. And I will stop here so we can hopefully have some time for some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation. So we're going to go to the Q&A session. I'm going to, because of time constraints, I'm going to limit each question to 1 minute, and also the answers for those questions for each panelist to 1 minute. So the first question comes from... So the first question is going to be is addressed to Dr. Siling and Haya. What interventions need to be done in the short and long term to directly support these communities? So perhaps Dr. Siling, if you can address this question first, and then after that, Haya.
Okay, that's a great question. So the one way you can do is regularly testing of the concentration of metals in the surrounding water for the communities in the freshwater, especially, and also do some, as I said, annual testing at least of the metals from the mining companies, and reporting those values to the local government or the federal government of Indonesia, so that you can have a report and see if there's any release of metals at some time per year which are higher and not acceptable, and there has to be some intervention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siling. Haya?
Thank you so much. So I think, to put it briefly, according UNGP is also, in case of this situation, what the government best to do is first stop all the mining in Kabaena because it's illegal in the first place, and second, restore the situation, and then give a remedy, like a serious remedy, assess, and also do control annually or twice a year to make sure that all impacted community is restored their rights, and also give the best restoration that the government and also the industry could give them.
Thank you very much, Ahaya. So the next question comes from Prabianto Wibowo. I believe he's from the National Human Rights Commission from Indonesia. So his question is addressed to Magdalena. So he has two questions. The first is, do the principles in the MSPF require companies to respect human rights? And how does the MSPF provide access to effective remedy for victims or impacted communities? Magdalena, if you can answer that question.
Yes, okay. You know, in order for countries to join, you need to set up a sort of a general framework. All the details about remedies and certain compensation levels, this is still to be discussed and probably agreed. But you know, we are going to discuss all these subjects during our next workshops, policy dialogue workshops. And of course, you know, NGOs are also invited to participate and present, you know, the cases. But for the moment, we don't have like such a straightforward, you know, commitment to provide, you know, a clear remedy to the, you know, to the communities, you know, the grievances mechanism. However, this is part of the overall framework in the MSP forum, and this is something that we'll have to work with in the with all the partners.
Thank you very much, Magdalena, for your answer. So the next question is for Chris. I actually have a couple questions, and I will take one question from the Q&A box from an attendee. So Chris, will the issues we are seeing in Kabaena violate the policies of most international auto companies? And what responsibility do they have to clean up the situation? And I also noticed that you mentioned about flawed certification system as one of the business risks associated with EV industrial expansion, right? So if you can elaborate on that point, and how is this certification system being implemented at the moment, and how does it impact Indonesia? If you can tackle both these questions, that'd be great.
Sure, big questions. Thank you very much, Hans. Yeah, with regards to whether they violate the policies of most international auto companies, I'd say our analysis shows that there's quite a spectrum of commitments with regards to different companies, some with very comprehensive commitments and others with much more broad and vaguer commitments. And I think in particular, for example, I could point to the issue of indigenous people's rights to free, prior and informed consent, where we actually see that very few automotive companies have explicit commitments to ensure that their suppliers respect this right, and is a major gap that needs to be addressed by the industry. However, they do have, in general, broad commitments to human rights and to conducting human rights due diligence. But with regards to those commitments, the mere fact that human rights abuses have been found in their supply chain doesn't necessarily violate their own policies. But what it does mean is that they should be taking action to address those commitments with their suppliers. And there's multiple actions they should be taking depending on what is occurring on the ground. You know? And actually one principle with regards to that, and I'd recommend, I can put it in the chat, Amnesty International published a series of principles related to the battery supply chains called Powering Change, And one of the principles there is finding solutions and not running away. So when confronted by human rights abuses in the supply chains, for major downstream companies to work with local stakeholders and rights holders to really find solutions and ensure that remedy and reparations are provided for those human rights abuses, rather than just walking away from the situation due to running the risk of negative media coverage, for example. However, there are clear circumstances where it may be actually the most the solution may be to discontinue purchasing from that particular location. So we heard today that that actually sourcing from this island is against Indonesian law. So I think in that case, then that would be one of the actions that automotive companies would have to take. But that is all to say that the types of actions should be taken in consultation and in dialogue and engagement with the impacted rights holders, and should be done based on what they are requesting. And yes, with regards to certification schemes and auditing schemes, so we have actually also published, Lead the Charge, another assessment that looks at the robustness of different schemes used by automakers as part of their due diligence processes, and have found a wide variation of robustness in those schemes, which has also been replicated by other studies by, for example, Mercedes and German Watch. So I think it's very important that automakers think critically about the schemes that they use and what are the potential flaws of that using those schemes could result in.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you for your excellent questions, and apologize for not being able to take all your questions because of time constraints. Now, I'd like to invite Amanda Horowitz from Mighty Earth, who will offer a US-based NGO perspective on the Kabaena situation. And then we're going to hear from Perrine Fournier from Fern, who will give us an EU-focused response. Please, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks, Hans, and thanks, everyone. I'm Amanda Horowitz. I'm based here in the United States. I'm the Senior Director of the Forest Commodities Program at Mighty Earth. We're a global environmental organization that works to protect nature and decarbonize the economy. I just want to say thank you to everyone. I think there were over 100, at some point 150 participants. Clearly, this is an issue that people around the world care about, and it's a case that they should. I think the case of Kabaena should be an international outrage. Dr. Schilling's and Dr. Dussein's research shows that concentrations of nickel are something like 70 times higher than allowable limits. These are sky high. The skin irritation are sadly just the beginning. Nickel exposure at this level is carcinogenic. It leads to lung, sinus, and many other cancers. And so I think where I'd like to leave us is with this challenge. How can international trade protect the environment and local communities while still accelerating the decarbonization everyone on the planet needs? That's what we're trying to do here. We know that this nickel is connected to the stainless steel industry. We know that it's connected to a whole slew of auto companies, everyone from Volkswagen, Geely, BYD, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Volvo, Toyota, Honda, Tesla, Ford, GM. I mean, the list goes on and on. Hayu Cobalt, Vale, Ford. They are building a processing plant in Pamola, and they see Kabaena as an excellent sourcing area. We know that we need EVs in order to meet our climate transition goals. But we believe every company and country that uses nickel can help protect the Bajau and drive broader decarbonization. The US has minimal tools, but tools that exist. The US can import this nickel. It's using tax incentives in order to try to improve these supply chains. We'll see how that goes. But the catastrophe on Kabaena is something that the Indonesian government and private sector, the auto companies, the stainless steel industry can address. If they want US to give taxpayer money to support the Indonesian nickel production, it cannot be poisoning communities. It also can't be fueling one of the world's largest coal buildouts. And I think I'll leave it there because I think we're almost at time. And I'll turn it over to Perrine for just a couple of other closing thoughts. But thank you, everyone, for coming together to talk about this incredibly important issue that should be an international outrage.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all. First, I would like to congratulate Satya Bumi for this excellent work documenting the impact of mining on nomadic sea people of Kabaena and making the link between these illegal and unsustainable activities and global EV supply chain. I also would like to thank all the panelists, and as a European, I would like to say a few words from an European NGO perspective and share a few thoughts on what we think they should do. The first thing, so as Fern is also a member of a coalition of the EU Raw Material NGO Coalition, and we feel that the EU's transition to e-mobility should be really used to reconsider our behaviors as passengers and how the circular economy should be applied to mobility. And then I would like also to come back to Magdalena's a question at the end of our presentation on what kind of incentive we should propose to Indonesia so that they can partner with EU, but also the US in for achieving our transition. And we believe that the EU should position itself as a leader in a fair and equitable green transition for all. And it could do so by engaging in equal and win-win partnerships with resource-rich countries such as Indonesia. This would imply reforming the WTO rules, which we feel are not fit for purpose to achieve our transition. So what has the EU to offer to Indonesia so that the EU can strengthen its position in the EV global market, but also so that Indonesia has an appetite to engage with the EU? So what would make such a partnership appealing to Indonesia in the current geopolitical context? So maybe some specific prices policies to add value locally, support domestic processing and manufacturing, maybe some transfer of clean technologies and cooperation programs to address water pollution, deforestation, some space for a participatory dialogue, including civil society and indigenous people and local communities to discuss governance issues. So that's a few thoughts, and I hope we will have the chance to continue these conversations with civil society. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Perrin, and also thank you, Amanda, for sharing your thoughts. And I would like to thank all panelists, and also to Satya Bumi, Fern, and Mighty Earth for hosting this event, and also to everyone who joined us today. Today's session highlights the pressing need for ethical practices and greater accountability in the global nickel supply chain to protect communities like the Bajau and their environment. So let's push for policy and industry changes that can prevent further harm. Last but not least, a full recording, slides, and transcript will be available for all attendees. And if you have further questions, you can reach out to either Satya Bumi, Mighty Earth, or Fern, and I believe their contacts will be uploaded. Oh, they're here on the screen, so you can see their contact, and please reach out to them if you have further questions. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.